viewers, today we are going to look at the great novel written by George Eliot, that is Mill on the Floss. It is a great contribution to the world of English literature, and her imaginary world is definitely enjoyed by all possible readers of all generations. Apart from this, there are some interesting objectives to understand and analyze this great novel. The first objective is to reflect on the societal influence on individuals. Second, to discuss the plot in Mill on the Floss. Third one, to study different dimensions of the characters that are presented through the novel. And the fourth one is to analyze vagaries of human mind under different situations of life and death. The story begins with an interesting scene, and the narrator stands on a bridge over the Floss next to Dorlcote Mill and watches a little girl and her white dog that stand on the bank of the river watching the mill. The narrator can see the light of a fire burning inside the little girl's house. The narrator proceeds to tell the story of what Mr. and Mrs. Tulliver were discussing in their house in front of the fire on that afternoon. Mr. Tulliver explains Mrs. Tulliver his wish to send their young son Tom for further education for a bright future, and Mrs. Tulliver also agrees and would like to take the consent of her sisters also. Mr. Tulliver considers Tom little dull when compared to his daughter Maggie, and Mrs. Tulliver considers Maggie as wild. But her comments are dismissed, citing Maggie's ability to read almost as well as the parson. Mr. Tulliver is a doting father, and he discusses with Mr. Riley about local arbitrations and troublesome lawyers such as Wakeham, and pauses for a moment and asks for Riley's advice about Tom's schooling and his career. It was a big problem for Mr. Tulliver. He was very indecisive when it came to Tom's education. He also brags about Maggie's intelligence to Riley. Maggie hopes to earn Riley's respect with an exposition to the book The History of the Devil by Daniel Defoe, but Riley is indifferent and he refuses to listen to Maggie. Riley recommends a parson named Stelling as a tutor for Tom. So, who is the tutor for Tom? Mr. Stelling. It is a favour to Stelling's father-in-law and to speak confidently than from first-hand knowledge of Stelling's merits. Maggie is little disturbed, but Yap, her dog, distracts her attention and announces Tom's arrival. Tom, who is always critical of Maggie, learns that his rabbits have died and is very upset with Maggie. Maggie begs Tom's forgiveness and they both go fishing the next day. This shows her intense love for her brother Tom. Mrs. Tulliver prepares for the visit of her sisters, all former Miss Dodsons, and their husbands and children who are not very friendly and consider themselves very respectable. Her sister, Mrs. Dean, brings her daughter Lucy along with her. Mrs. Glegg is the first of the Dodsons to arrive at the Tullivers, followed by Pullets. Mrs. Tulliver reminds her husband that Mrs. Glegg might ask for her loan of £500 back from the Tullivers because of Mrs. Tulliver's poor behaviour. Mr. Tulliver also decides to ask them for £300 which Mosses cannot afford because of their fragile finances. But Mr. Tulliver leaves for Bassett with a firm mind to force Mosses to give £300, but Mrs. Moss's behaviour brings a change in his heart and he leaves the place with a request to look for an opportunity to raise funds. That indicates that the element of humanity in Mr. Tulliver is intense. Tom, Maggie and Lucy and Mrs. Tulliver prepare for a visit to the Pullets. They make card houses together and Maggie is again criticized by Tom for knocking the card house. Mrs. Tulliver spends time convincing Mrs. Pullet to go to Mrs. Glegg and convince her not to call back for her £500 from the Tullivers. Sally, the Pulet's servant, ushers in Lucy covered with mud and the women scream, a different scene altogether. Seeing Lucy covered in mud, Mrs. Tulliver goes in search of her 2 children. She finds Maggie missing and rushes back home with a hope that Maggie will be there. Maggie runs off from the Pulets with the idea of reaching Dunlow Common and joining the band of gypsies, and she expresses her wish to live with them and learn many things from them. After Maggie is stripped of all useful things like bonnet, etc., sometime gypsy men return to the camp and they put Maggie on a donkey, and Maggie realizes that they want to kill her. She also recognizes the road to St. Ogg's and sees her father riding down the same road, and the confused gypsy man returns Maggie to her father. And that was a happy union. At home, Mr. Tulliver speaks harsh words to Mrs. Tulliver and Tom on Maggie's behalf, and she never hears of the incident again. The narrator describes St. Ogg's as an inland town and narrates the story of St. Ogg, the patron saint of the town, who ferried across a woman with a child on a windy night. Later, he realizes that she was Virgin Mary. Mr. Glegg is busy thinking about the glorious history of St. Ogg's while Mrs. Glegg sulks over quarrel at Tulliver's. After a brief discussion, the Gleggs decide not to trouble Tulliver for money and spend a quiet, quarrel-free evening. This indicates that all loved peaceful life. Before Mrs. Pulet can advance to the Tullivers to announce Mrs. Glegg's amiability in the matter of the loan, a letter arrives from Mr. Tulliver telling Mrs. Glegg that her £500 will be repaid within the month. Now let's see what happens to Tom when he is sent for further schooling for higher education. Tom goes to school under Mrs. Stelling for his first term and the only student, and is not competitive enough to learn Latin and Euclid. He misses Maggie a lot. Maggie comes for a visit before the end of the term and helps him with his studies. Maggie impresses him and Mrs. Stelling, but his comments, superficial cleverness and are quick and shallow with reference to her attempt to run away to the gypsies, make her sad, and she leaves the campus in a huff. Tom feels lonely and terrible. Tom goes home gratefully for Christmas at the end of the half year, happy to see his home. The narrator meditates upon one's affection for the worn furniture of childhood versus the impulse to acquire newer, nicer things. Christmas at the Tullivers is little tense. As Mr. Tulliver is disturbed by Mr. Pivot, a new land owner upriver who purports to use some of Mr. Tulliver's water power. Mr. Tulliver perceives it as Wakeham's crooked plan and decides to fight it out through a lesser known lawyer, Mr. Gorey, which much against the wishes of Mrs. Tulliver. Mr. Tulliver is provoked by the fact that he has been forced to borrow money from Wakeham's office to repay Mrs. Glegg. Tom has learned that Wakeham's son will be sent to Mr. Stelling next term. Mr. Tulliver wants Tom to treat Wakeham's son as the boy is a poor, deformed creature. The jealousy, the negative emotions come into picture. Tom arrives back for a second half year at school with Mrs. Stelling, and a new student has arrived. Who is he? Mr. Philip Wakeham. Initially, they try to get along, but later Tom tries to reassert his superiority in the face of Philip's older age and knowledge of fighting stories by indirectly reminding Philip of his handicap. Philip and Tom's relationship continues in the oscillating manner of their first meeting. It was never steady. Tom's education continues in the manner that Mr. Stelling sees fit, though much of it will be of no practical use to Tom in his profession. Tom is happier in his second term with Mr. Stelling. Stelling has also hired a drill master for Tom, the local schoolmaster, Mr. Poulter, and Tom enjoys his war stories. And because of Mr. Poulter, there is a misunderstanding between Tom and Philip and they exchange harsh words. Maggie comes for a second visit to Mr. Stelling's and Tom. Maggie is impressed by Philip's intelligence and Philip's also feel good. Tom tries to show his swording skills to Maggie, but he accidentally gets injured when it falls on the foot and becomes unconscious. Mr. Stelling rushes into the room. Tom receives immediate attention and treatment and bounces back to life. A strong emotional bond brings Tom, Maggie and Philip together. Philip expresses his liking for Maggie and Maggie reciprocates. Mr. Tulliver also becomes aware of closeness between Philip, Maggie and Tom and cautions his children to be away from him. Tom and Philip never become close friends and their personalities soon continue to be at odds. Tom continued with Mr. Stelling's fifth session while Maggie goes to a boarding school with Lucy Dean. Maggie hardly ever saw Philip again and she sensed that he and Tom were no longer friends. Mr. Tulliver was now engaged in the lawsuit with lawyer Wakeham and Pivot and any mention of the name Wakeham angered him. Tom continues monotonously with his education. Maggie distances away from Philip as Tom is not friendly with him anymore. November spells doom when Maggie comes to Stelling to tell Tom their father lost the lawsuit and is bankrupt. Very sad situation. She further shocks Tom by informing that Mr. Tulliver has fallen from the horse and is injured and has lost his senses. Tom and Maggie go forth together into their new life of sorrow. Maggie is forced to meet Philip in Red Deeps and she also makes it clear that she cannot embrace happiness at the cost of her family's pride and self-esteem. Maggie returns home with a conflict in her. Philip returns home feeling that Maggie is the only woman in the world with enough love towards him in his deformity. He vows to be Maggie's guardian angel and to do anything, bear anything for her sake. That was the kind of intense love Philip had for Maggie. Tom is frustrated with the slow accumulation of money and decides to visit his uncle Glegg with Bob Jackin to ask for Glegg to advance him some money for his new venture. Mrs. Glegg is convinced by Bob, entranced with stories of lesser women getting good deals, buys some muslin and net. Bob also gets Mrs. Glegg to lend £20 of her own money towards the venture. After a conflicting argument with self, Maggie decides to part ways with Philip, though they were never into stormy or blemished relationship. Maggie meets Philip in the Red Deeps and tells him that they cannot meet again, and Philip acquiesces but insists they spend a half hour together before they part. Philip insists that she is unnaturally stupefying herself instead of reaching for a full life. Philip offers a loophole to Maggie. He will continue to walk in Red Deeps, and if they meet by chance, there will be no secrecy involved. Maggie's eyes consent and they leave it at that. The day after Maggie's last meeting with Philip, Tom confirms Maggie's interest in Philip. Initially, he suspects his own mind but later accepts it. He humiliates Maggie and uses harsh words. Philip stands by his good intentions to Maggie and accuses Tom of being incapable of understanding what he feels for Maggie. Yet, the end of the chapter wonders about the cause of a certain dim background of relief in the forced separation from Philip. Tom finally gains financial stability and clears family debts, and Mr. Tulliver becomes emotional, but he still has bitterness towards Wakem. The next day, after a brief speech by Tom at a business party, Mr. Tulliver feels proud and heads home. He accidentally meets Wakem and there is a violent exchange. Tulliver announces that he doesn't forgive Wakem and his last words before death are, "This world's too many honest men, puzzling." Maggie asks Tom to forgive her and they hold each other and weep. Lucy Dean, wearing mourning for the death of her mother, spends some time with her handsome suitor, Stephen Guest, who is sure of his love for Lucy. She also mentally prepares herself to welcome Maggie and also makes her stay comfortable. Lucy Dean and Maggie are busy discussing their relationships sitting in Lucy's parlor and Stephen enters. Stephen is quickly fascinated by Maggie's tall, dark beauty and her frankness. A mishap during the boat ride that was offered by Stephen brings them closer. But Maggie is still stuck with Philip and Lucy shows interest in convincing Tom to get both Maggie and Philip married. But Maggie refuses and wants to manage everything on her own. Maggie goes to Bob Jackins' house where Tom now lives. She reassures to that she will not treat Philip as a lover, though Tom does not believe her. The two reconcile before Tom returns to work. Mr. Dean compliments Tom for his performance and also cautions him about the twists and turns of the business world. Tom mentions his wish that Guest and Company buy up Dorlcote, but Mr. Dean is skeptical that Wakem would sell his property. Mr. Dean reveals to Lucy Tom's wish for Guest and Company to reacquire Dorlcote Mill from Wakem. Lucy begs to be allowed to tell Philip of Tom's wish and have him bring it about. Lucy has told Philip of Tom's desire to reclaim Dorlcote Mill, and Philip has come up with a plan to accomplish this and improve his chances with Maggie. He also informs his father of his love for Maggie. Wakem is also made to realize that Philip loves Maggie dearly and after little hesitation signals his willingness to give up the property. Maggie has returned to Dorlcote Mill to give explanation. Tom is upset because she has returned unmarried and disgraced. The whole town now calls her as a fallen woman. Stephen is forgiven by the world, Maggie is not. Mrs. Tulliver supports her throughout traumatic journey of her life. Maggie prefers to stay at Bob's place and Maggie remains indifferent to the behavior of the people. Tom at least, however, remains unmoved in his refusal of Maggie. Maggie finally asks Dr. Ken and Wakem about Philip, but she finds no answer. Maggie receives a letter from Philip expressing his forgiveness and understanding the promise to wait for her. Maggie collapses in tears upon reading the letter at the thought of Philip and Lucy's pain. Dr. Ken becomes more and more frustrated at the unwillingness of the women of St. Ogg's to employ Maggie. Emotionally sick Lucy also gradually recovers and tries to forgive Lucy. Maggie repents and explains that she never meant to deceive Lucy. The day after Lucy's visit, the weather changed in St. Aug's and rain has fallen continuously, making the Floss dangerous, especially for nearby houses such as the Jackins. Stephen tries to get in touch with Maggie through a letter and pleads her to ask him to get back to her. While Maggie was fighting her emotions back and decided to part with Stephen forever, suddenly she feels water below her feet and she realizes that cold river water flowing under her. The Flosses begin to flood. Maggie wakes up Bob and his wife and wades through water to get 2 boats. She dangerously paddles through water currents and tries to reach Tom and save him. Tom is overwhelmed and both of them try to save themselves, but before they can get there, a piece of wooden machinery capsizes their boat and they drown together, embracing each other. How beautiful the emotion of sacrifice and love that is displayed through the love of sister and a brother. In this session, we understood how beautiful the emotion of love and sacrifice has brought Tom and his sister Maggie together. In the next session, we will look into the elements of this great novel and meet you there. Thank you.